Across Britain, hundreds of secret bunkers still lie hidden in forests. They were built for ordinary men, chosen in secret, expected to die within 2 weeks. Almost nobody knows why they were built or who was meant to die inside them. In June 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk were littered with the wreckage of Britain's defeated army. Over 9 days, 338,000 men escaped across the Channel, but the price was catastrophic. Nearly 1,000 tanks, thousands of guns, and most of the army's vehicles abandoned to the advancing Germans. The British Expeditionary Force had come home stripped of its heavy weapons, its radios, its ammunition, its very means of fighting. The War Cabinet pored over casualty lists and equipment ledgers, each entry a tally of what Britain had lost and could not quickly replace. The sense of peril was not just military, it was existential. France surrendered on June the 22nd, leaving Britain alone, with the enemy now a mere 23 miles away across the Channel. In Parliament, Churchill's words cut through the fog of uncertainty.
"We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender."
But behind the defiance, his private warnings were starker. The regular army, he admitted, could not hold back an invasion. War Cabinet minutes from June 19th record his insistence. The nation must be prepared for the worst. The Home Guard, raised in a matter of weeks, numbered over 1 million by August, yet their rifles were old, anti-tank weapons were scarce, and training was uneven. Senior officers doubted these volunteers could hold the line for more than a few days against the Wehrmacht. Army staff papers from July laid it out plainly: Britain's defences were a patchwork, and a determined enemy might cut through them with speed and violence. In the corridors of power, anxiety turned to urgency. With every intelligence report of German landing craft massing in French ports, the War Office drafted new contingency plans. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion called for a cross-channel invasion by September, backed by a fleet of 1,400 transports and a dozen divisions poised to strike at the heart of southern England. The Luftwaffe's bombardment of airfields and radar stations intensified, each raid a test of whether the Royal Air Force could hold the line long enough for Britain to regroup. Beneath the surface calm of village life, the leadership faced a terrifying arithmetic. Britain's survival depended not only on its battered army and its outgunned Home Guard, but on something entirely new, a force that could endure, unseen if the country fell. In the War Cabinet's private calculations, the hour was late, the odds were dire, and the need for an invisible last line of resistance had become inescapable. Colin Gubbins understood the rules of hidden war long before Britain faced invasion. In mid-1940, as defeat loomed and the government scrambled for answers, Gubbins was called to London's War Office with a singular task: design a resistance that would survive occupation. His selection was deliberate. Years earlier, he had watched Russian partisans slip through forests, sabotaging enemy lines and vanishing before daylight. In Ireland, he saw how local knowledge and sabotage could paralyze a stronger force. These lessons shaped his doctrine: small autonomous cells, each able to act alone, invisible to the enemy and to each other. Gubbins was not a man for ceremony. He reported directly to the Ministry of Economic Warfare, and Churchill, sidestepping the usual army chain. His orders were precise: build a force that would not exist on paper, whose members would be ghosts among their own neighbours. Each cell would know only its own members and its own patch of ground. There would be no master list, no written plans to betray the network if one man fell. He saw that the best recruits were not soldiers, but men who knew the land: gamekeepers, poachers, farmers. Sabotage, he believed, demanded patience, silence, and the ability to disappear. Under his direction, the auxiliary units would hide their weapons, their bunkers, even their true purpose. Officially, they were part of the Home Guard. In reality, they prepared for a war fought in silence. Training manuals were disguised as a country almanac, the Countryman's Diary 1939, its cover promising only high-worth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results. The logic was merciless. If capture was certain, members were ordered to take their own lives rather than risk betraying the network. Gubbins made no promises of survival. Every detail, from sealed orders to rationed rum, reflected his understanding that their greatest weapon was secrecy, and that Britain's last defence would be built on men prepared to vanish without a trace. Nearly 3,500 men from England, Wales and Scotland disappeared into the war's shadows, not as soldiers in uniform, but as ordinary villagers, gamekeepers, farmers, poachers, teachers, shopkeepers. Their lives were rooted in hedgerows and muddy tracks, their faces familiar at the local pub or market. They knew every ditch and hollow, able to vanish where others would stumble. The government needed men who could move unseen, and so quietly Home Guard officers picked those who could keep secrets and nerves steady. Each man signed the Official Secrets Act, sealing his silence. Even their families and fellow Home Guards stayed unaware. By day they worked the land, by night they prepared for sabotage, their oath unbreakable. One recruit remembered, there was no way out for them. They were going to be caught and tortured. They were ready to kill themselves before allowing themselves to be captured. 3,500 volunteers were split into patrols of 4 to 8, each assigned a hidden bunker beneath woods or fields. Their training materials arrived disguised as a farming almanac, the Countryman's Diary, 1939. Inside was a coded message. Highworth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results. For some, like 16-year-old Trevor Miners of Cornwall's Cligger Head Patrol, secrecy was a heavy burden. He remembered being trained to kill and receiving a white feather, a coward's mark, from a neighbour who never guessed the truth. These men accepted their fate. If invasion came, they would not return. Even their rum ration came with a warning, best issued on return from patrol. Ordinary men, waiting beneath the fields, their duty and names buried with them. Their legacy hidden in the roots of Britain's forests. A letter, a quiet word at the post office, or a subtle nod from a Home Guard officer. These were the signals that began a recruit's journey into Britain's secret war. In Highworth, the postmistress stood watch, her list known only to a handful in Whitehall. If a man passed her silent test, he was blindfolded, driven through twisting country lanes, and delivered to Coleshill House, a Georgian estate hidden deep in Oxfordshire. Here, the world shifted. Recruits entered a place where even sunlight seemed suspicious, every door locked, every order whispered. Training at Coleshill was relentless and shrouded in secrecy. Days started before dawn. Men learned to handle explosives, derail trains, and kill without a sound. Their teachers, veterans of Shanghai and Ireland, taught the craft of silent violence. The only manual allowed was a battered booklet disguised as a farming almanac, the Countryman's Diary, 1939. Its cover promised nothing more than tips on fertilizer. Highworth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results. Inside, coded diagrams and demolition recipes replaced crop advice. One passage, circled in pencil, warned there was no way out for them. They were going to be caught and tortured. They were ready to kill themselves before allowing themselves to be captured. Secrecy was absolute. Men returned home with mud on their boots and hands that shook from what they could never share. Even their rum ration came with strict instructions. Be scrupulously fair in its distribution and not over-lavish. Best issued on return from patrol. For some, the silence cut deep. Trevor Miners, just 16, received a white feather, a coward's mark, from a neighbour who never guessed the truth. Above ground, life went on. Beneath it, Coleshill's men prepared for a war without names. Across Britain's fields and forests, more than 500 bunkers were built in total secrecy. These were not the pillboxes scattered along the coast, but hidden chambers dug deep beneath the roots of ancient woods and the edges of quiet farms. Each one was a feat of rural engineering shaped by local hands, gamekeepers, carpenters, quarrymen, men who knew how to work unseen. The bunkers were designed to vanish into the landscape, entrances disguised as badger setts or hinged tree trunks, trapdoors buried under bracken or turf. Even the ventilation shafts were masked by hollow logs or clusters of nettles so that nothing betrayed what lay below. Inside, the spaces were cramped but carefully planned. Corrugated iron roofs arched over concrete floors. Wooden bunks lined the walls. There was a stove for heating, a chemical toilet, and shelves stacked with emergency rations, tins of bully beef, water cans, and the strict rum allowance. Each bottle labelled with the order to be scrupulously fair in its distribution and not over-lavish, best issued on return from patrol. A narrow escape tunnel, sometimes 30 feet long, led to a second hidden exit, an insurance against discovery or siege. Every detail was calculated for survival. The typical bunker could shelter a patrol of 6 to 8 men for up to 12 days, completely cut off from the outside world. Lighting came from shuttered hurricane lamps. Weapons and explosives were stored in sealed boxes ready for sabotage missions. Training manuals were disguised as a harmless farming almanac, the Countryman's Diary, 1939, its cover promising nothing more than tips for fertilizer. Its cover even printed the line, "High-worth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results." The scale of the network was astonishing. Counties from Cornwall to the Scottish borders were dotted with these hidden strongholds, each known only to a handful of men. Some bases were built into old mine shafts or chalk quarries, others beneath woodland clearings or the edges of golf courses. Builders worked at night, hauling in concrete and timber under cover of darkness, swearing silence even to their own families. In places, the earth still bears the faint scars of their work: a dip in the ground, a mossy mound, the memory of a trap door long since rotted away. Above ground, nothing disturbed the peace of the countryside, but beneath, Britain was preparing for a war that would be fought in silence by men who expected never to come home. 12 days. That was the number written on ration sheets and whispered in doctrine memos. 12 days underground, cut off from the world above, waiting for the enemy to pass, or for orders that would never come. Each patrol's bunker was stocked with just enough food, water, and ammunition to last those 12 days, no more. Bully beef, hard biscuits, and water cans lined the shelves. Rum bottles, sealed and strictly inventoried, bore a warning that cut through any illusion of comfort. They'd be scrupulously fair in its distribution and not over-lavish, best issued on return from patrol. But everyone understood that a return was not expected. The logic was brutal and final. The auxiliary units were not meant to fight and survive, but to sabotage and disappear. Their mission was to wait in silence until the enemy had overrun the countryside, then emerge at night to cut railway lines, destroy bridges, and ambush convoys, acts that would buy time for a nation on the brink. The timetable was unyielding: rations for 12 days, a rum line for courage, and a single, unspoken expectation. None of them would last beyond the second week. War Office memos spelled it out with chilling clarity. If the patrol was discovered, capture was not an option. There was no way out for them. They were going to be caught and tortured. They were ready to kill themselves before allowing themselves to be captured. This was not a soldier's war. These were farmers, poachers, teachers, men whose faces were known in every village, now handed a suicide order and a mission that promised only oblivion. Their training manual, disguised as the Countryman's Diary, 1939, hid its violence behind the language of crops and fertilizers. Its coded message, "High-worth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results," was a private joke, a mask for demolition recipes and deadly intent. One recruit, Trevor Miners, only 16, remembered the weight of that secret. He learned to kill in silence, then returned to his village, where a neighbour, knowing nothing, slipped a white feather into his hand. To the world above, he was a coward. Beneath the fields, he was already living with the certainty of death. 12 days. That was the fate written into every ration, every bottle, every oath. Not one of these men expected to see the 13th dawn. Trevor Miners was 16 when he vanished into the shadows of Cornwall's cliffs, a schoolboy drafted into a war that demanded silence above all else. He learned to kill in secret, memorized the pages of a sabotage manual disguised as The Countryman's Diary, 1939. Its cover promising nothing more than tips for fertilizer. High-worth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results. His hands grew steady with explosives and wire, but his voice stayed quiet. Even his family never knew what he prepared for in the cold bunkers beneath Cligger Head. One day a neighbour pressed a white feather into his palm, a silent accusation of cowardice. She saw only a boy in a Home Guard uniform, not the recruit who had signed away his future for a mission with no return. Miners remembered the order, cold and absolute. There was no way out for them. They were going to be caught and tortured. They were ready to kill themselves before allowing themselves to be captured. The rum ration, doled out with trembling hands, came with its own warning. Be scrupulously fair in its distribution and not over lavish. Best issued on return from patrol. But everyone knew what that meant. Above ground, the world carried on. Harvests, markets, church bells. Below, boys like Trevor waited in silence, their courage mistaken for cowardice, their names buried with the secrets they kept. On September 16, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe's failure to defeat the Royal Air Force left the Channel unconquered, and the planned invasion of Britain was shelved. 12 divisions and 1,400 transports waited in French ports, never ordered to cross. The directive ended not only the invasion, but also the activation of Britain's secret resistance. For the auxiliary units, months of silent preparation led nowhere. Their bunkers stayed hidden, supplies untouched, sabotage manuals unread. Rations and rum measured for a 12-day fight remained sealed. No coded message arrived, no patrols crept out to cut lines or sabotage bridges. The fate written into every sealed order became a silent burden. Duty suspended, sacrifice unspent. Above ground, these men returned to daily life, carrying secrets that would stay buried for decades. The Invisible Army, trained for a war that never came, faded into the countryside, their existence locked away by the Official Secrets Act. The bunkers endured, empty and silent, reminders of a terror that never arrived, and a courage that would never be called upon. For decades, the story of Britain's secret army lay buried as deeply as the bunkers themselves. Every member had signed the Official Secrets Act, and the files, maps, training manuals, even the names remained sealed in government vaults. It was not until 1990 that the first official records were quietly opened to the public. War Office files, ration sheets, and the battered copies of The Countryman's Diary from 1939 finally surfaced, their coded instructions and warnings no longer hidden from view. But even now, the full scale of the network can only be guessed at. In 2020, a forestry crew clearing trees in the Scottish borders stumbled upon a rusted ventilation pipe poking from a mossy bank. Beneath it, they found a bunker almost perfectly preserved. Corrugated iron walls, wooden bunks, a stove, and the faint outline of an escape tunnel leading into darkness. Archaeologists catalogued the find, but the names of those who once waited inside remain lost. Across Britain, hundreds of these strongholds still lie beneath woodland and pasture, their entrances caved in or swallowed by roots. Some are mapped by local historians, others are whispered about by those who remember odd dips in the ground or stories told in confidence. The war never came to these hidden rooms, yet their silence endures. It is a reminder that beneath the ordinary countryside, a secret war was prepared and, in many ways, still lingers just out of sight. Beneath quiet fields, ordinary men prepared for a war that would erase their names. Their manual warned, high-worth fertilizers do their stuff unseen until you see results. They rationed rum and rehearsed suicide because, as one recalled, there was no way out. Today these bunkers still shape the landscape, unmarked and unresolved. In every woodland shadow, Britain remembers what it nearly became. What would we risk if called in secret?